So, needless to say, the American Revolution was kind of a big deal. But one of the biggest effects of that big revolutionary deal was the development of a more distinct American identity, and I reckon we ought to talk about that. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now before we get cozy with the features of this burgeoning American identity during the post-revolutionary period, I need to tell you something very important. Like if you see a question or an essay prompt about American identity on an exam and you do not remember what I'm about to say, then you burnt. Okay, here it is. After the revolution, a new national American identity showed signs of developing. However, it is of vital importance to remember that regional cultures and identities were still very strong. Like if you're watching this and you're an American, then you've grown up in a time when you probably identify as an American first and not necessarily as a Georgian or a Michigander or whatever. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, then check that link in the description. Anyway, that's not how it was in the era that we're considering. In general, Americans of that age were far more attached to their regional identity than they were to their national identity. And while it's true that movements like the First Great Awakening worked to create a more common identity among the colonists than had existed before it, still regional identity won out. However, the American Revolution itself was a major event that created the conditions for an even stronger national identity than even the Great Awakening. But even still, you need to remember that Americans of that age still had kind of a layered identity with national and regional layers, you know, like a juicy lasagna, or one might say an ogre. Ogres have layers! Okay, so with that big idea hanging as a banner over the rest of our discussion, then let's talk about the development of a national culture in the United States and contrast it with the regional variations. Now, perhaps more than anything else, American identity in this period coalesced around the idea of liberty. The Constitution begins with the words, "We the people," and then the chief characteristic of that "we" was that they possessed the blessings of liberty. Therefore, one of the key features of the emerging national identity after the Revolution was that Americans were a free people. And I'll give you two illustrations that demonstrate how that identity was beginning to work itself out. First was the abolishment of aristocracy. Now, if you'll recall from my video on the Constitution, in the aftermath of the Revolution, every state adopted a new constitution. And every dang one of them mandated that their governments existed by the consent of the governed and that no titles of nobility or hereditary aristocracy would be allowed. Now, this of course was a reaction against the way social power was held in Europe, not least in Great Britain. Their power was passed down through families, which is to say it was hereditary or inherited. And so all that mattered with respect to who wore the social power pants was that that person was born into the right family, not whether or not they were actually skilled in the wise use of power. Therefore, by abolishing this social hierarchy of hereditary power, Americans embraced the idea of meritocracy. And that just means that any person could work their way up through the ranks of the social ladder owing to their talent and not necessarily their family of birth. And that whole idea was linked to a growing emphasis on more widespread education because an educated population was the only way to maintain the civic virtue that a meritocracy demanded. And here's where I tell you that there were, of course, regional variations on this whole liberty element of national identity. Now, I probably don't have to tell you by now that the idea of meritocracy and opportunity for all patently did not extend to all Americans. First of all, let's talk about women. Now, despite the significant movements for the democratization of politics in the new states, many of which at least lowered property requirements for voting, women were apparently not deemed worthy of the promises of liberty. For example, women had no legal standing in the states and were instead understood as dependents of their fathers or husbands, and in that way, the men represented women politically. Therefore, in all the states, women were encouraged to participate politically not by voting, but by raising and educating virtuous sons who could then shape the future of the nation. And if you'll recall, this was known as the Republican motherhood. But then perhaps the most significant regional variation on the theme of liberty was the presence of slavery. Now, some states in the North moved toward the emancipation of enslaved blacks. For example, Vermont's constitution banned slavery immediately, while Pennsylvania's made provisions for a gradual emancipation. And all northern states introduced some form of abolition by 1804. But southern states were in no mood to interpret the principle of liberty thusly. And that's because they relied heavily on enslaved labor for the success of plantation agriculture and therefore allowed the institution to remain entrenched in their society, effectively cutting off all hope of America's black population to enjoy the blessings of liberty. And that's a pretty massive bummer, but you definitely need to know that the black population of America didn't just sigh and go on with their lives as second or third class citizens. No, in many ways they worked to form their own notions of American identity. For example, our boy Gowan Pamphlet was formerly enslaved but then gained his freedom. And after doing so, he became a minister and led one of America's earliest black Baptist congregations. And in that way, he was able to demonstrate how marginalized voices could still claim their portion of the American identity lasagna even when the rest of society was not yet ready to deliver on its promises. Additionally, free blacks in the North established mutual aid societies, church communities, and various educational institutions to work for the betterment of their own people, and all of this in spite of their ongoing social and legal legal marginalization. Okay, now the second illustration of the emergence of a national identity concerns religious toleration. Now, during the colonial period, many colonists were suspicious of the entanglement of church and state, not least because the British used the Anglican Church as an instrument of control in the colonies. But after the Revolution, most of the states erected a wall of separation between church and state. And as a result, most of the new states completely defunded their state churches in order to keep private matters like religion free from government meddling. But again, there were significant regional variations on this theme of religious toleration. For example, Massachusetts mandated church attendance in its constitution while also emphasizing freedom of worship, which shows a deep commitment to its history with the Congregational Church. Okay, now let's finish by doing a quick survey of how American national identity was showing up in art and literature and architecture. Now, as far as artists were concerned, let me introduce you to two of them. First was Charles Wilson Peale, who painted Revolutionary War leaders like Washington and Franklin and Jefferson as Republican heroes. Now, Peale mainly adopted the neoclassical style, which emphasized order and harmony, and thus his portraits romanticized the subjects and events that he portrayed. And in that way, they contributed to the emerging national identity by glorifying the heroes and events of the Revolution. I mean, look at Peale's most famous portrait titled Washington at Princeton. The lighting is really dramatic, and Washington looks like a straight-up boss. And you know, if you don't respect him, he's gonna blow you up with a cannon. Anyway, the second artist to know is John Trumbull. Like Peale, he also painted historical scenes from the Revolution in the neoclassical style, the most famous of which was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Trumbull's depictions were also real drippy and romantic. Like, the serenity of his depiction of this event was entirely fictional. It was way more chaotic, and most of those people were never even there at the same time. But in romanticizing the signing of this document, Trumbull helped Americans identify with this moment as a key ingredient in what it meant to be an American. Okay, in terms of literature as evidence of American identity, let me tell you about Hector St. John de Crevecoeur. And this guy was considered to be one of the first, if not the first, truly American novelists. In his book, Letters from an American Farmer, he described the American as a new man that blended European roots with frontier opportunities. Additionally, he described America as a land of opportunity and social mobility on account of its devotion to the principles of liberty, while also noting the dark realities of slavery. And finally, let's consider how architecture contributed to an American identity. So starting in 1792, construction began on the U.S. Capitol in Northern Virginia. Now, it was constructed in the federal style of architecture, which was an explicitly American mashup of the neoclassical style inspired by Greek and Roman architecture. And so this style, with its domes and columns and symmetry, emphasized order and democracy. And more to the point, this was a deliberate shift from the Georgian style of architecture, which was popular in the colonial period, and that signaled a deliberate break from British culture. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other Unit 3 videos, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you cram all the contents of this course firmly into your brain fold. And I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.